Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. One thing that Catherine didn't say was my first job was actually at the Center for Human Resource Research, so I really cut my baby teeth on the NLS, and it's really been important to a lot of the work that I've done over the years. So what I want to focus on are, I'm going to kind of give a broader view about the types of uses of the NLS for policy, the kind of categories of the way it can be used. And the first, of course, maybe even the most important, is descriptive. What is the extent and the distribution of the outcomes and the behaviors of policy interest? We can't develop policy until we know that. And as you heard, the NLS covers so many topics. It covers topics of labor market behavior and outcomes. It covers other economic outcomes, savings and pensions, even bankruptcy. It covers education outcomes and behavior. It covers demographic outcomes, marital status, family structure, non-resident father involvement, fertility and migration. It covers health and health behavior, a lot of work on obesity, and also on smoking and alcohol and drug abuse. It covers use of public benefits, and a lot of behavioral outcomes and pro and anti-social behavior, volunteer work, voting behavior, truancy, runaway youth. So there's just a rich amount of information on these kinds of very important outcomes. And not only just descriptives of a single outcome, but also correlations, looking at the biography or the bibliography of the NLS. Marital status and other correlates of personal bankruptcy was one of the papers, or marital disruption in childhood obesity. So again, these are just descriptive, but they give you some sense of the associations and the populations under which certain kind of behaviors are more likely or not. Other kinds of descriptive data that the NLS really is very useful for is the changing behaviors and outcomes across cohorts. So the fact that you have different cohorts at the same point in the life cycle really gives you a historical snapshot of how things are changing over time. Are we getting worse? Are we getting better? And so many of the papers have looked at things like gender and racial gaps in adolescent antisocial behavior. And again, some of these I just took from the bibliography just to get a broad sense of things. There was a cross-cohort study of veteran status and social mobility. A lot of work on changing inequality across cohorts, college entry and completion, cross-cohort studies of socioeconomic causes of obesity. That's changed because obesity has changed a lot over time. So have the causes, or have the correlates of it changed? Because again, we're still just talking descriptive right now. And looking at descriptively the association of family income and ability in determining educational achievement. Has that association changed across cohorts? Have the demand for alcohol and marijuana changed across cohorts? So that is something that the NLS really is positioned to do very well. Of course, because it's a longitudinal survey, and so many of them have gone on for so long, it's also positioned to do descriptive data across the life course, or summarizing across the life course how much of one's life, looking across childhood, how much of one's life was spent not living with a biological father. And a paper I found, does time preference change with age? So just looking again across the life cycle. In addition, there's intergenerational correlations, which is one thing that I had done some work on, looking at intergenerational mobility because of the matching of parents and their children across the cohorts in the way the data were collected. There have been, and I saw there were 341 citations in the bibliography that had the word intergenerational in it. So important to the family, but also just seeing how this is correlated even in adulthood. Income and earnings, education, welfare dependency, body mass index, family instability, language, human capital among immigrants, again, intergenerational correlations, marital expectations and age at first marriage. Again, importance of these intergenerational correlations really calls out the importance of the family and these kinds of initial conditions. So the descriptive stuff is hugely, hugely important and really cannot be discounted. But then to try to get at more causal mechanisms, the NLS also is very, very useful. Been a number of studies of what I would call quasi-experimental evaluation, looking at the rate of return to years of education, or rate of return to the quality of education, the benefits of attending Head Start that Dan mentioned in one of his greatest 10 papers, the effect of compensation on military labor supply. So these are policy levers that can be manipulated, and what is the causal impact of these? Effects of welfare and marital dissolution and fertility, effects on child care, characteristics on child outcomes. Again, you can regulate child care characteristics. So all of these things are really trying to look at the causal mechanisms of policies across a variety of domains, taxes and alcohol beverage domain, minimum wages. So when we think today, however, of program evaluation, there is a lot more emphasis on prospective data and less emphasis on quasi-experimental retrospective data. But I would argue that some of what we're doing now, some of what we've learned now in the state-of-the-art in program evaluation, which random controlled trials and really understanding how programs are implemented, the differences. You can't just look at a generic Head Start program, right? Because they're all implemented very differently. You really have to understand and unpack it or look at the particular context. Or you can't look at any generic job training program. So right now we really understand the specifics of programs and try to figure out how they can be generalized and taken to scale. So we've really gotten away from the more generic, job training stuff. But we needed those kinds of data to even figure out where to start. So I wouldn't give up on using retrospective data for some aspects of program evaluation. Again, I don't think it's going to be the gold standard, but it's going to provide evidence that that will help you decide where to work, where to look. I think even more importantly is the information in the NLS that really helps us estimate the behavioral parameters and unpacking causal mechanisms. That's actually hard to do in an RCT. So with the rich data of the NLS, you have a better sense of what the initial conditions are. You've measured them very well, much better than you can do when someone is at baseline just entering a program and you try to capture that. And you see the broad array of influences on that person's life and how they interact. So I think I would argue that program evaluation is fine and it's been important, but more importantly, I think, is the NLS on really trying to understand what these causal mechanisms might be that might help you think about designing programs. Things like paper that Lonnie Berger and Maria Cassian did on maternal repartnering and non-resident father investments in children. That can provide some information on designing responsible fatherhood programs. Information on basic labor supply elasticities will tell us something about tax policies, and so forth. So I think that's really an important, the causal mechanisms is one of the most important uses, I think, of the NLS. But then the last one that I want to talk about briefly is its use in microsimulation. Microsimulation is something that I never did before I came to the Urban Institute. But it's really an important policy tool in that it can give you some what-if scenarios. Think of it like a river, and you put inputs in upstream, and the outputs are downstream. And if we're thinking about a child growing up, an individual, reaching adulthood and beyond, you've got the downstream kind of, or the upstream kind of inputs, and then along the pathway, things enter in that affect outcomes downstream. So a microsimulation model can kind of, the microsimulation model that I'm actually talking about, which is specifically the social genome model, I'll describe that in a sense, that's kind of the metaphor I'm talking about. So at the Urban Institute, we use microsimulation models for a lot of things. We've got a tax policy model and a health policy model, and we've got a benefit policy model. But one of the things we started working on recently is it's called the social genome model, and it was originally kind of developed by Bell Sawhill, and now we are working on it in partnership with Brookings and with Child Trends. And the purpose of this social genome model is to really understand how to impact an individual's well-being through interventions early on in the life cycle, or maybe in the middle of the life cycle and so forth. So that's where the metaphor of the river is. The Social Genome Project is really a life cycle model, and it takes it from a prenatal period with 6 life stages and benchmarks for success in each life stage. So it starts with family formation, goes to, and the characteristics, the inputs for at the family formation stage are birth weight, age, education, income of the mother. It goes then to early childhood, reading and math skills, behavioral outcomes, middle childhood, again, some reading, cognitive skills, socioeconomic skills, adolescence, high school graduation, criminal involvement, are they a parent or not, transition to adulthood, college degree, income, adult, and so forth. That sounds an awful lot like the NLS. So in fact, you need data as inputs to develop something like a micro-simulation social genome model. And we are using the NLS as the inputs in that model. We actually have two versions of the model, one that uses the NLS child data, one that uses the 97 data. So, it's so important to have that broad data so you can see what are these inputs, and what are the potential outcomes that happen as a result of the inputs. So some of the things that we've done with the model so far is we've looked at what might happen if teenage moms delayed births by 2 years. What happens at each stage, and what happens in adulthood. We've also looked at in early childhood, what happens if you have an intervention like Head Start that might increase cognitive abilities by a certain amount. Again, what happens at each stage, what happens at the ultimate outcome. The really important advantage of a social genome model is that when you're looking and trying to compare different interventions at different types of interventions that might have different types of short-run outcomes, in a social genome model, you can kind of put them all into the same metric. You can look at the long-run outcomes on adult income. So you can actually compare the benefits of a program that might delay mother's childbearing for 2 years with another intervention that actually affects kids' cognitive outcomes. Very different interventions at different parts of the life cycle, and you can have similar metrics. So I think there are some advantages of this kind of a model. Again, it wasn't a model that I ever did before, because I was always looking at, let's just look at these micro studies, and let's look at whatever outcomes we can kind of get. And if we're going to try to assess across different, kind of do a meta-analysis or do a survey of the literature, we kind of do the best we can at kind of saying, well, this is more effective than that, but you don't really have a metric to compare them. So I guess I'm going to argue that that's another really important way, is to have the kind of behavioral information that can be used in this sort of a policy experiment. And I'm going to stop there, and I think other panelists will have more specific examples.